Okay, this is the second session of our DMing panel. The first session we kind of covered the basics off, and it did take a couple of hours. Thankfully, I'm joined by two great DMs, actually, who bring different perspectives on the art and craft of DMing. I'll let them reintroduce yourself. I'll start over there with, well, I'll call him Ben. And if he will he introduce himself as Ben? He's had an injury as well, so you know.
It's pretty manly, but I'll
very seriously.
We'll skip over it for now. Hello, I'm Ben, also known as the Flickering Torch here on YouTube. The channel you're watching on is my one.
Yeah. Cool. And
hi, I'm Addison, and I am 1/3 of the Pod of Many Things panel. And you can check us out on there.
Excellent. I'm sure Ben will leave links to a couple of things. Obviously, you found Ben's channel, and if you haven't checked out some of his videos, please do, because his one on Forbidden Lands has already in a week got over 100 video views, which I think is fantastic. So it gives you an idea of his content. It's really good.
I'm basically
and if you
famous
haven't
now,
seen
yeah.
it's really good. If you haven't seen the first video, then please go back and see that. What I hope will happen over time is these videos will grow in terms of the way people watch them, and they will find nuggets of gold in them for DMing. And tonight we're going to start off with, I've got two key areas I want to cover off with the panel tonight. And the first area we're going to talk about tonight is campaigns. And it's about the structure, the various ways people approach it. And it's really one of the very fundamental questions a DM has to go through. So I kind of want to start really by sort of throwing open the most obvious question. We'll start with Ben, but most obvious question would be, do you prefer to run your own kind of homebrew kind of campaign, or do you prefer to run a more published, polished setting / campaign? What's your take
I don't usually run modules. The first module I've ever sat to run, I started running like a couple months ago. So yeah, it's mostly all homebrew stuff.
Okay,
for me.
Good. I'll come back to more why, but it's mostly homebrew with yourself. Yeah, you prefer the homebrew side. For the definition, for the help of the audience, I've used the word homebrew, but really haven't talked about it. So for someone brand new, Ben, what does homebrew really mean?
Homebrew is just basically coming up with your sort of own adventures, own worlds. Sometimes it's used to refer to your own rules and stuff, but it's basically like, instead of doing it out of the book, you're kind of just doing it from the old noggin.
Okay, great. I'll come back more on that in a minute. And so, same question, Anderson, really. So, what do you prefer to run? Do you prefer to run your own stuff, or do you prefer mostly to run something that's been published for you?
I kind of cheat. I kind of go the middle ground. So, one of the things that D&D is really good at is they release settings books that aren't modules. So they are just a setting. And I will use something like that, but run my own adventure hooks and my own story inside that, rather than using the adventure hooks that are given.
Yeah.
But if you gave me a choice, I would probably go more towards homebrew than module play, because I don't know, I've never really got on with DMing module play. Like, I've tried it a couple of times.
As you know, all these questions are loaded. So the thing about all of these, they build as they go along. So I'll quickly explain. I like both the stances. I'm kind of in the middle ground too, Addison. So I'm very much on that par where I kind of take something that might be published and then put a spin on it. I think probably the best example is that one running with Ben at the moment, Forbidden Lands. We sort of touched on it last time. So very much they've got a kind of an idea for the setting. I've kind of liked it. And then I've kind of thought, okay, what can I do with it? And then I've gone off and branched off and started creating my own stuff for it, which is what I've enjoyed. So it's the nice thing with the middle ground is probably the pros, and then there are some cons. So we're going to talk a bit about the pros and cons. I mean, Ben, you touched on more the homebrew style. So tell the audience members really about what are the real cons of homebrew, and in your view, what are the real negatives? And although we're going to be talking about homebrew for you, I'm also going to ask Addison the same question about his view on homebrewing cons and pros as well in a moment. We'll start with Ben. What are your thoughts around the pros of it first?
I mean, the pros is you kind of get to flex your own creative muscles. I think you can definitely tie things more in with character backstory if you're homebrewing. It's just it's easier to just show up at the table, because I think we've all as DMs had that one week where we forgot to plan, and if you're doing a module and you forgot to plan, like I can foresee the moment where you're like, oh, I don't know what's going on. Everyone give me 5 minutes to read like the whole page.
Interesting, yeah.
It might also be like a slither of laziness in that I can come up with things and like have like a page of notes for the whole session, whereas if I'm running a module, I kind of need all the backstory and all that in my notes, right? So,
right, yeah. So that's some good pros. What about just to add a couple of cons on that? So some of the big negatives in your mind of homebrewing, because obviously you do it. So what are the hardest parts of it for anybody that was sort of considering doing it, or also maybe struggles with the same areas you do?
I mean, the big area for me is trap design. I think writing traps, you have to be like very thoughtful of how you're doing it. And I've never been good at writing traps, so I just kind of usually just ignore that whole aspect.
Okay, that's really good. Anything else that you wanted to add on the sort of cons of homebrewing? I can see that Addison is itching to get in here because he's got that fidgeting look, which is good.
Sometimes I think it's kind of hard to like foreshadow things because you need to know like what you're doing.
Yes. Okay, that's excellent. So some difficulties with foreshadowing. So Addison, same question. Some pros of, because I know you can homebrew. I know that. I've heard how people have talked about some of your games. And, I'm definitely data mining as people are telling me things. I'm thinking, okay, that sounds like a good idea. I'll have a little think on that. So what do you, when you're homebrewing, what are the big positives and what are the negatives of it?
So Ben brought up one of the biggest ones is like that intricate tying to like your characters and giving them and designing your campaign to be a bit more personalized. And I think that's a really good and needed thing. But I also think one of the most, and this might be one of the most DM answers ever, is the fact that I can just move the goalposts if I want to. So like, I think one of the problems with module play is that sometimes your players don't get to that checkpoint. I know that's a very video game term, but they don't get to that checkpoint, or they don't get to that cutscene, and you're like, what do I do now? Whereas when you homebrew stuff, even if they go around it, you go, well, now all I've got to do is move it left a bit, and they'll bump into it anyway. And like a lot of people are about to be like, oh man, that's how he does it. Like, and I'm like, well, yeah, like I just move the goalposts a little bit to make sure that I hit those beats and that people don't miss those. And I think that's really important. In terms of
the primary benefit there is the flexibility that homebrewing allows you, which I think both of you hinted at. What would be one of the, or a couple of negatives of homebrewing in your?
I think one of the negatives of homebrew, and is it a negative or is it a trap? I suppose those are both the same things. One of the traps of homebrew is that people believe, and I certainly believed this when I first started, that you need like copious amounts of notes.
Yeah.
Like you need like notes coming out the wazoo to run homebrew, and then like Ben said, there is a way to just turn up, and I think not falling into that trap of like over planning everything, and then your party just going, I don't want any of that. I want to know what this goblin who's just here for some reason is doing, and then having to improvise a whole session when you had all this material that you've just ripped up in the background because you don't need it anymore is quite disheartening. It can be quite disheartening and quite a con. Like that would be, when I first started DMing, that was like one of the most heartbreaking things when I didn't use stuff. And it really got to me. I've grown up.
That's really resonating with me, that answer, quite well, actually. I can fully understand that, and that really sticks. I mean, because I found, again, this is a test, really. I would suggest this straight away for anybody that's interested. I know we're talking about campaigns here primarily. We will break down the campaign structure a little bit more as we go along. But if you really want to test as a GM, I'll always throw the challenges in. Do what I do is one of the best things in terms of to build confidence and learn about yourself is take a module, don't unwrap it till 2 seconds before you play. Unwrap it and see if you never need to refer to it and still run the game. See how it turned out. You'd be surprised at how good you can become at doing this. Never having read the module, just by immediately gathering quick bits of information off the page, because you'll realise very fast what's important in the module, what's important in that idea that they've got there. And you also know yourself, because if you've homebrewed, you know that there is only so far. If you've got 3.5 hours or 4 hours slot, you kind of know yourself how far that's realistically going to go. You can have a module 20 levels deep. You're not going to get that far in 4 hours. So you kind of know there's only a certain amount of points. So it's a really interesting way of discovering real test. And if you've got players around you willing to accept the challenge, listen, guys, here's the module. I've never opened it. I'm now going to run it. So I'd flick it to the back and I'd be reading off the description, right? This is the setup, and this is what's going to happen. Let's go. And I learned a lot. I learned a lot about myself doing it. So when it came to campaign design, it really helped me ad lib. So it's just a small thing, very difficult to do. I wouldn't even offer this to anybody who hasn't got a few years under the table. Don't bother. But if you have got a few years and are looking for the next challenge, then try it, because it's a brilliant way of building on. Now, for me, the homebrew, like Addison said, is it's very flexible. I think both yourself and Ben have mentioned this flexibility, which is absolutely true. But I think one of the keys for the players is that the setting's got to balance what I would call originality and accessibility for homebrew. If it isn't original and it isn't accessible, frankly, the players won't like it. You know, and I think that's a fundamental truth of homebrewing, in my view. But how do you feel about that part? When I talk about it having to, if you're going to homebrew something and build this campaign of your own design, no matter what the system you're using, it's got to have some originality and accessibility to it, so players can really fall in with it. Does that make sense, or how do you feel about that, Addison?
On our podcast, we talked about something similar, and we called it like an aim or a unique selling point.
Yeah.
Not an aim, sorry, a purpose. What's the purpose of your setting, of your adventure? Yeah. And then we called it like the unique selling points, so the USPs. And
because players love that, don't they? If they can fall in love with something, then they'll gravitate into it.
You look at I know it's not a role playing game, but look at like Magic the Gathering as a game in itself. All the different planes and all the different settings have different thematic components, and you see players attached to those different thematic components and those unique selling points and those purposes. So I think it's the same in role playing games as well. That if you can create a world that has something so unique in it that it makes people like fall in love with it, it's great. I've had a setting where once every 4 years, for 4 months of the year, is complete darkness.
Yeah,
and you get all these things like werewolves, vampires, drow, durgar. They all come out the woodwork because they're like, oh, well, this is our time now. We can take over, and that reinforces the world itself and stuff like that. So the world is harsh.
So that's a very unique. That's a really interesting. That's quite accessible. People I can visualize that very easily. If I was to put my mind into a player, I can see that. That makes a lot of sense, and fun for the GM as well, which is another big element of this. Homebrewing should be fun, but accessible. I like that answer. What about yourself, Ben? How do you feel about it? Do you think
originality is an interesting one? I find myself stealing ideas and then changing the genre on them. So, I mean, if we take a campaign I ran as like a quick one-shot was a train robbery. Basically, I'd watched the train robbery episode of Firefly, and I was like, I want to do that. But I'd also just finished reading ICRPG Worlds' setting, Ghost Mountain, which is kind of like Wild West town stuck in purgatory, and there's like demons and angels like fighting over it. So I was like, what if we take that train robbery and just plunk it into like Ghost Mountain, because it's not exactly an original idea because it's the idea taken from a different genre and just put somewhere else, and I think that is kind of more the originality that I go for, because I'm usually quite inspired by the kind of media I'm consuming.
Fabulous. Okay, the next part I wanted to touch on for the pair of you is this. I'll start with Addison on this part. Is I believe the more players know and feel about the campaign and the imaginary world that the campaign is set in, the better it is. So how do you, in your games, go about getting the players that kind of information? What's the way that you approach it?
Me to start?
Yeah, please, yeah.
I show them they can break it.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about that. How does that work in one of your games?
So, for example, that if there is an established order of things, and they go against it, then the consequences of that become very apparent, and knowing that their choices have these rippling consequences is a massive part of my games in general. Like, every choice you make is going to have a consequence in some way, especially if you do go against the grain in terms of how your society deems something. So, for example, in one of my games, warlocks were seen with suspicion because of the fact that for people to make those packs, they obviously want something. There's obviously something that they want. However, then I introduced a concept of these warlocks who make celestial packs. So they make packs with good entities to just help people. And then
how would the players know this kind of information to start? So how would that kind of feel, that imaginary stuff, be something they can gravitate towards? Do you set it up so there's a lot of backstory that they read through? How do you go about doing it? Because it sounds fantastic.
I think it's usually through things like interactions with things.
Okay. So it comes out organically as the story unfolds.
Yeah. So the way that one of my players wanted to do it, and I was always toying with the idea, so I'd let him be that category of warlock, and then we built the city together and some of the NPCs, and then they began to realise that they could make fundamental changes to this world because I would let them.
Okay.
And then they contribute.
So they got quite a big buy-in. Once they understand the concept of what you're doing, there's a big buy-in for players in your games because they've got ways to kind of break or change, if you will, the campaign world around them.
Yeah, of course.
That's great. What about you, Ben? How do you sort of do it?
So mine usually starts with like a paragraph elevator pitch before we all start, so everyone kind of knows like our themes and like how to so they can fit a character in, basically. And then the first like 2 or 3 sessions are like very micro scale things. So if you go into like, it'll be like you start off in this village, and this village is all the world that you know of right now, so that then they can slowly learn the things about the setting. Because if you if you front load them with loads of information, they're not going to know what's going on. But if they start in the village, they know they can know everyone in the village. They can know all the buildings. They can know like the local churches and the local dungeons and the local politics. And then when they venture out of that, they've only got to learn about the next thing. Or if they need something with wider implications, they can just ask, and I'll tell them. Like, if your character would know the thing, just ask. I'll let you know. I don't think it's like great to just front load all that information, because they're never going to remember it, and then you're going to be like, but guys, this is so clever. My plot twist here is so clever, because if you remember 6 months ago when I gave you 7 pages to read, if you read the 8th page, the secret 8th page, you would have known.
I'm glad you brought that up. That's brilliant. Yeah, because you're absolutely right. You see, I think I learned a long time ago that the key is that you kind of want the campaign to be a paragraph. That's it. You know, the initial setup is a paragraph long. I won't go to any great shakes to provide the players with 25 pages of information. I'm pretty confident I could probably do it in any game. If I really want to, I can overload a player with thousands of pages on herbs. But the truth is, I know they're not even going to read one of my A4 pages of paper, if I'm honest. Because players don't. That's just not what they're focusing on. Most of them. Some might, because they're very... You know, we all seen players who are very dedicated to breaking down what you're doing, and that's great. But most of them won't. So you're right, both of you, to bring up the different aspects that what you're looking to do. I think for myself, what I try to do is have that one paragraph buy-in, and obviously pitch it. If I know the group, you can pitch it so it fits in with the style of play that they want. I always try and keep that paramount to what I'm looking to try and achieve. Sometimes it's just the paragraph will sort of set the initial tempo, and then I start it very small. The campaign will be very big, but I'll have a very small idea, and then allow that to organically grow out or not, depending on what way the players want to go with it. So that's how I tend to look at it. I want to kind of combine this now into published settings, really, with the advantages and disadvantages of a published setting. I've got an awful lot of experience around published settings in terms of running them and what you do and don't do. What about yourself, Addison? What do you feel about the benefits of a published setting, because particularly in light of this question, it's very apt, because obviously the buy-in is a lot easier, because if you say Dungeons and Dragons, right, we're going to do the campaign path about Strad here, or whichever vampire you want, it's a buy-in straight away, isn't it, to the players? They kind of know immediately, oh, that sounds good, it's a new take on an old classic. What are your view on published settings, pros and cons?
Published setting pros is that there is source material for players to peruse at their own thing.
Yeah, that's a massive benefit, isn't it? Yeah.
There's always an established pantheon, so you don't have to make, because that is genuinely, I personally believe, one of the hardest things to do is to make a pantheon of gods that don't crisscross and make each other obsolete. So I think having that is quite, but I think a major con is that, especially in something like Strahd, if your players don't like the tone of that setting, because Strahd's very unforgiving.
Yes, I'm glad you touched on that. We will be talking about tone in a minute.
That tone's unforgiving, and like because the initial buy-in, you're gonna vampire that's like ages of thousands of years old, sounds great, but like the journey to get there is not exactly forgiving. So you might have an issue. Whereas with certain settings that are a bit more open-ended and sandbox-like, you can have what Troy described it the best as like loading screens. So you can have like these little points where you start then trickling in more information. If you explore over here, we're going to look over here, and you don't need to know the rest of it. And it's almost like waypoints on a map. He described it 100 times better than me. But
no, that's fine. That's I can totally visualize what you're trying to say. That's excellent. Ben, similar question then. Pros and cons of a more published setting. Something that's kind of against your natural grain.
So I like to read a lot of published settings, but then I think if you get to a certain point, especially with games like A Song of Ice and Fire, if you've got a player that knows a lot more than you, the reason they're playing the game is so that they can explore the things that they know a lot about. Like if you're playing in Game of Thrones and then you don't know, like, let's say for instance you don't know who the head Lannister is, you don't know who Tywin is, and the player wants to go like message that person and start talking to that person, they have certain expectations about a setting that you might not have read those certain things or garnered those certain things. So if you've got like like Shadowrun, if you don't know all the mega corporations or you've like created your own, like players who know about the setting and are playing in their game because they love the setting are going to be a little bit disappointed when they don't get to experience the things that they like about the setting.
Massively disappointed. Absolutely, it's a great con. Yeah, absolutely. Very good. Yeah.
Definitely.
I think both of you touch again very well on this subject, very well. I mean, I like published settings for one reason, really. I find them quite enjoyable because it has a buy-in immediately from players who maybe have seen that setting before. So if I'm dealing with an older group of players who've been around since like me, the dawn of RPGs, then they will love original D&D, and they'll know Greyhawk like the back of their hands. And there's enough flexibility in it as an experienced GM I know it well enough to chop and change, and then I can slightly front load and say, look, these are the differences that you will know exist that aren't in there. So before we start, this is what you know doesn't exist. So that kind of helps get around the problem you've kind of highlighted, but it's limiting. A published setting, you're right, players expect, and they don't expect sweeping changes. So it's much more complicated to put them in. So it has very significant pros and cons. That's why I kind of like the Addison approach myself, where it's a bit of both. Yes, I'll use the published setting in terms of that I like the maps and it saves me a lot of work, and I might use Pantheon because, again, for exactly the reasons you've said, that will help me establish quicker the theme and tone of what's going on in that world, and I can kind of take the best essences of that. But equally, I'll then try and incorporate what I feel is the right things to do with that setting. So I love that. But we now need to turn, rightly, you've already hinted on it, on tone, actually. And I wanted to sort of read this because this is something I wrote down some time ago, and I think it's very apt for tone. They're very important when you talk about campaign, the initial kind of everything. We talked extensively about what is important initially in the first video. We're now talking about the campaign and we've got to reach the bit where we touch on tone even more. Of all the elements, I think, that keep players coming back for more, it has to be tone. It has to be tone. Now, before I whitter on my great belief in why, I'm interested to hear from you first, Anderson. Tone in your own games, surely you see as well how critical that is to the players' buy-in. What does it do for the players, that kind of, when the tone is right and feels good, what does that do for those players? And how do you utilise it as a GM to work for you?
So, tone for the players. For myself, I know that tone's really important because I'm a writer. Like, my expertise is in writing.
Yeah.
So I know, like, in terms of fiction, you have to have a appropriate tone for your audience to get them to buy in, and I think that is it. Once the tone is set, and once the tone hits that like sweet harmonic resonance that you get with between all the other characters and all the other players and everything, that's when you suddenly see like them get more invested, and they're like, oh, this is something I like. It's not to be confused with genre, which a lot of people do.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
It's about, so mystery is a genre.
Yes.
Okay.
I'll give you a few tones just to help the audience if it helps the situation, because you're absolutely right. I mean, here's a few tones. The White Wolf's World of Darkness is a tone, okay? Deadlands is a tone in itself. Castle Falkenstein is a tone. D&D settings like Planescape and Dark Sun, they're tones. They give an immediate tone, a background.
I think I disagree with the World of Darkness one.
Well, it's its own tone, you see.
Yeah, but Changeling is definitely not the same tone as the rest of the World of Darkness.
No, but it's still the World of Darkness. It's a tone.
I think when we talk about tone,
we can debate it as much as we like. And I totally get the point. It's just I had the same discussion, I'll be honest with you, with Mark Hagen, the guy who wrote them. And I had the same discussion about it. He turned around and said, no, they're the same thing, Sean. Stop being silly about it. It has a tone. And I went, okay, well, you wrote the thing. So I respected that. I'm with you 100%. I do get it, but I thought I'd throw this in just for Mark, because he's a great guy and he may well watch this. So sorry, go back there, Anderson. You were saying.
So tone is when I think about tone, I think of like emotional tone. So if I want to build a tone of conflict, I will make that conflict apparent. And if people like that in terms of, so say it's two warring countries, and they like that, and because they might like the fact they have to pick a side.
Yeah.
Like, sometimes people like picking a side, and they like getting into like the moral justice of things, or the justice of things, or the law of things in general. So when you hit that tonal thing of like conflict and national conflict and stuff like that, and you see them get interested and start to invest in that, then that's what tone does for your players. It gets them to engage and think about ways to engage, not just, oh, I'm going to see where this goes. They're like, no, I want to actively partake in this, and I want to do this. Like,
so the tone
massive.
the tone, as far as you can see as well, it increases the investiture on the players want as well.
Yeah.
What's your thoughts on that, Ben?
So I think tone is one of those things you need to include in that first paragraph before people sit down and even think about joining the game or making the character. I've run games all across the tonal scene, from action comedies to very serious, like, political drama-y things. I think, if it isn't apparent before you sit down and make your character what the tone of the campaign is, you're not going to have a good time, because you're going to go to the table
step back.
I think it's the same thing as a setting, where if you have expectations, you kind of have to meet those expectations. So I've run a Shadowrun game where it was like an action comedy, and everyone knew around the table it was an action comedy, so everyone was cracking jokes, and their characters were all like ridiculous. But if they brought the same characters to the Game of Thrones game I ran, that tonally wouldn't mesh. Like, everyone in that had to have a serious character with sort of serious motivations, and we weren't so much cracking that many jokes around the table, because we all were trying to keep in that tone.
The moment of what's going on. Yeah, okay, that's excellent. Absolutely brilliant, because those are great bits. Now, here's another part of tone that's really missed sometimes. All of us, as GMs, have our own tone as well. So we have our own distinctive tone. So if you think about your own tone, I'm going to ask you in a moment what that is. But if I tell you about mine first, just save a few moments to process it. I would say that if people really looked at what I do, I would say mine is quite grim. It's humour led, but it's very grim. The settings are quite grim. That tends to creep into most of the games I run. First of all, I'd say it's a tone that actually comes quite naturally to me, so that's why I find that easy to do. It probably arises through my worldview, if I'm honest, that generally it is quite grim out there, and you kind of have to bring that a little into the games to get people to invest, and at the same time lighten it up. I probably think that's how I kind of look at things. I wouldn't say that games are dark by any stretch of the imagination, very dark, but they have a grim feel to them, but at the same time it's fun for players to play them. There's comedy in it, I think, in a lot of my games. There's little one-liners I like to throw in. I like to make the characters the heroes one way or the other, whether they want to. By damn it, they're going to become it. And I do like to, throw players lots of odd curveballs with their characters. I call it shifting sands. It's a tone that I kind of developed where nothing is absolutely set, constantly keeps moving. So you have a bit of stability, but you're never quite sure what it's about around the corner. And that's how I would describe my own kind of tone personally. How do you feel about tone, your own tone? Ben, what kind of tone do you feel you would bring to any game no matter what the setting? Because the setting doesn't matter. You have your own distinctive tone.
I don't know. I don't know what I would describe my tone as, because, yeah, like I said earlier, I tend to run very different games tonally.
What about picking a few words out, maybe, then, that people would generally say about your game? That would kind of reflect the tone, in a way. So if someone was in your game, what would they say about you if they were picking a few key words?
I guess fast. I don't like running slow games.
So there's a real tempo, high tempo to the games.
Yeah. That one is really tough for me, because I'm very much run games influenced by what I'm interested in at the time. So if I'm really glad you said it's tough, because that is good, because a lot of the audience will also struggle with that question. If they were thinking about it themselves, I don't actually know my tone. I thought we were talking about the tone of the game. Well, you are, because your own tone comes into it, which you often forget. What about yourself, Addison? Do you feel you have a tone that you've developed over a couple of years at the table, or is it it'll always be ongoing, but how would you describe your tone?
I try and foster a real sense of collaboration at my table. So I am telling this story with you, not to you, and not about you, but with you. And then if I was to then pick some statements, I'd say it's very tempo led, very tension led, depending on where we are on the tension graph determines the tempo, and the speed and how people feel. But all in all, it's very much a collaborative,
So you're encouraging for your tone. Collaboration is paramount within the games you're running.
Yeah,
really important, big part of the tone you bring. It's really important actually to measure that sometimes. So I think it's really important throwing it in here. We shouldn't actually try. It's another thing I got thrown this question once before about, should I try to fix my own tonal habit? No, not at all. You can't run away from it. That's who you are as a GM. That's part of you. Embrace that. But occasionally run games that are at odds with it, because it helps develop you as a GM. So don't be frightened to tackle a subject that is light-hearted. In my case, go for some light-hearted games as well as some darker themed games that match what you're very good at. Also choose other games which create that different approach. So definitely worth exploring. So I want to, now we've flirted a little bit around the edges of kind of campaigns. We've talked a little about that. I want to go in just a fraction deeper on one very important aspect of this, really. The missions themselves. The very mission. What's the key to a good story mission, if you will, or that initial bit that they're going to do that night, that story for that night, a few nights, if you will? What's the key? So we'll start with Addison this time. So what's the key to a great mission?
Connection. So having it have some sort of connection to the party, to a player character, and having it, even if that connection is very flimsy and very small, it's from their hometown. It's nothing to do with them personally, but it's in the direction of their hometown. Then that automatically gives that person more buy-in as they begin to wonder about the consequences if they do not succeed in what they're doing.
Okay, brilliant. So having a connection, that creates a buy-in. That's, again, understanding the players, which is very, very good to a mission. Would you be able to give, say, an example of how you know things are going well right off the bat with the story? What's the key ingredient for you that you kind of know it is started on the right foot rather than you're struggling straight away, and you can kind of feel that around the table? What's the immediate notice to you as a GM that it's working?
That it's working is that they're willing to do everything that they need to do. So we've talked about this privately, but like if your players are bought in, they are not only willing to do the like high tension, like sneaking about the mansion or the heist or whatever, but they're also willing to do the planning and the research.
Yeah.
So or scout out and not engage, or even run away when they realise actually we can't hold it here, so we need to move back.
Good.
So
very good.
That lets you know that it's successful. The minute you ever hear a D&D player, I'm sorry, this might be a sweeping generalisation, but this is mainly my experience.
No, they're definitely important for the DMs watching and listening.
The minute you hear somebody go, we should probably go to a library and research, but after you talk about a mission, you're doing something right, because usually most people would go, well, let's go and get what we're doing, or let's go kill what we're going to kill, and then they die, like, because they haven't done any of the prep work. Whereas if they go, we go invest, then there we go.
Yeah, that's excellent. Okay, Ben, same question. So just to recap it, obviously, what makes a good mission, and how do you know people are engaged with that mission?
I think what makes a good mission is a definitive end. If you like run like 3 or 4 sessions and there was nothing like accomplished or completed, your players are going to feel kind of like, well, we're not really making any progress. We're just going encounter to encounter. I think
that's a good one.
I would rather have my 4-hour play session be cut short at 2.5 hours than never end.
Okay. Yeah.
If we get to a definitive endpoint, that means I've done my job well, and if it's near the end of the time we've allotted to play, that means I've done my job very well. If we sit around the table and spend 4 hours in town talking to the different gangs to try and get them all to work together, and then by the end of the session they're still like not working together, I feel like I've kind of failed. Like there's no like, if you think about it like a TV show, there's nothing making them want to go to the next episode because nothing happened in this episode.
Yeah, brilliant. I totally agree. They're great points both raised. I mean, I've kind of broken it down over years of considering this very important question, because it's one of the most critical questions, GM, because it is a lot of aspects built in on this. I found out it's really as simple as this. If I can turn around to a player after, I've had my little piece to set the situation up, and, I believe I've got a buy-in, and I can pull a player off to one side and say, just for my benefit, what are you doing? And he says, well, this is what we're going to do. This is the plan. This is what the story is about. That's a success, because it has to be so simple, so succinct that anybody can understand what the goal is, the mission, the goal. Because if it's too complicated, it's too diluted, if it's too complex, then nobody understands what they're supposed to do. And exactly like you just said, Ben, you got that kind of, you feel like you failed. And it probably comes down to this very point about setting that mission, that situation so clinically clear. It doesn't mean you're telling them what to do. It's just, it should be simple. If it's go rescue a princess, that's pretty straightforward. That we got to find her. Where is she? Let's go looking for her. Great, because it's really clear. That's why a lot of the classic stories in D&D they're classics, because they are very succinct. They don't tell you what to do, but they're very clear on what you've got to do. And that, I believe, is the essence of a great mission. I think you can easily foul it up as a GM. And somebody challenged me after they watched the first video, which is quite interesting. It's bringing in here on what Ben said, really, about the focus I think myself and Addison primarily had, Ben as well, an agreement to a large extent, was about our focus was primarily on our players around that table for obvious reasons. We highlighted those in the first video. But I will say this, as much as I believe that absolutely, paramount, without the GM, like Ben has just hinted at here, you can turn what could be, actually, I might have got that statement, I've not really made it clear to these players, you can quickly reset and say, guys, let me just clarify that, because I don't think I did a good enough job. This is the clear goal here. As the GM, you can always get yourself out of trouble as long as you see that you're in trouble, and that's what good GMs will always manage to do, and it won't even seem like anything's gone. So I like the fact you touched on that here. Was there anything else about missions in general, or the initial concept of what makes a good story? Is there anything you would give as a tip or piece of advice to anybody who's trying to make a good story?
I might be beginning to sound like a broken record, but consequences.
No broken record. That's excellent.
Like consequences. So if you've done a mission beforehand that will directly affect the mission that's happening now, let that happen. So say, for example, let's use Ben's example of getting the gangs to work together for some reason. So you get, and say by accident, you actually set it off that they end up fighting more in that mission. Yeah. And you go back and say, oh well, I couldn't do it. And then your next mission is to go steal something from one of the. Let them use that to their advantage, or use it to their disadvantage. Say there's a brawl in the middle of town. Well, that warehouse that's got all their stuff in is going to be probably not as guarded now. Let's go now. Or because everybody's scared of each other, everyone's on high alert, so everywhere's fortified.
I absolutely concur with you entirely on that. I think Ben will have to nod his head, I hope, and say, that's how Sean generally does. There's a lot of consequence based on what the players do or do not do. You can definitely feel it. If you press your advantage, it can be to your massive benefit. If you decide to, and it can be to your detriment if you don't realise what you've just done. Just put you in over your head. So I totally think that's fantastic. What about yourself, Ben? Any final thoughts on a tip for making sure the mission is just right or set up correctly?
Try to write one night of gameplay to start your campaign off with that's got a very definitive end point, and if you get there, stop the session.
We are going to talk a little bit about that in a minute. We're going to move on to section 2, so we're going to touch on a bit about how to do that, which in the next part. So that's really good. Final thing on this initial foray into sort of campaign, initial stories. Headquarters / reoccurring cast, NPCs, if you will. How important are they to your games? And what are your sort of thoughts around that, Addison?
I think NPCs are really important, especially if they have some form of power. If they are somebody who can affect change, you should definitely keep track of them. Yeah. And your players will probably have to invest in them because of the fact that that's an avenue in which they can affect change as well. Headquarters, I've never really been able to. I don't know why, but when I've tried to set up headquarters for players, they've never really took it. They've never really wanted it. It shackles them down.
It could be down to your own. It could be down to your own personal tone, and you might not realise it. A number of factors play, so that's a very valid point.
I've asked about it, and they're like, "Well, it's just something to keep in it. It's not really that helpful."
That's brilliant. I love that. If you ever play Forbidden Lands, you'll realise just how important headquarters are, just so you know, or what you call a base of operation, how important it is. It's very interesting.
Are you putting mechanics behind these headquarters that you're setting up for them so they have a reason to want it?
So, like, for example, everybody's like, well, a bag of holding's great. And I'm like, well, what if you could literally have, like, a vault where it's protected, and therefore, like, if that bag of holding something ever happens to it, you lose it, because I'm not gonna lie, I'm that GM who targets that straight away. Like, if you've got one and I can see it, I'm having it, because I'm getting all your stuff, and then I'm showing you the folly of your putting all your eggs in one basket. So I think that I try and put mechanics behind. I've tried to use things like Matt Colville's Strongholds and Fortresses, and Strongholds and Castles book.
Strongholds and Followers, maybe.
Yeah, and it just doesn't seem like the players that I play with on a regular seem to see it as like a shackle, and they don't seem to want it. So I've tried.
That's fair enough. Fair enough. Anything you wanted to add on top of that, Ben, regarding that one point, or you're comfortable we've kind of covered it?
Yeah, I always try and get recurring NPCs. I usually let the characters just write down they know 3 NPCs, and then when they need an NPC, they can write really quickly like what that NPC is, and then that would just be their go-to kind of guy for that thing throughout the whole campaign.
Yep.
In Shadowrun we had like a contacts roll, so you had so many contacts, we had to roll for them to see kind of like what their relationship with you was. So we had this one NPC that our guy had 1 piece of blackmail on, so if he wanted something now, he could totally get whatever he wanted, but this was kind of like the last time he could bully this guy. So the next time he called him, he would have to kind of come up with a bargain, which I quite liked, because it's kind of like in Star Wars Lando Calrissian, like Han thinks they're fine, but they're not friends. So like I think contacts rather than friends is a really interesting one to do. And the stronghold thing, I think, really relies on the kind of game you're running. Because if your characters have to move around the map a lot, they're probably not going to want that stronghold. But in a game where they're always staying in one city, they'll probably like need a base of operations just so they're not having to pay for the same tavern every night. And I definitely think like upgrades and incentives somewhere to level that up really helps. Forbidden Lands has got the system, obviously, where you can build like loads of stuff, so that really helps.
I think there's some valid points here, and I think it reminds me a little bit when we talk about the NPCs and the strongholds. I think for me, I kind of I allow the players to kind of. It's funny, you know, as I said to you off camera, you know, many times I've put what I think are really good NPCs together, and it's not those ones that the players gravitate to. So I've learned the value of kind of have a concept, run it, see what works, and then if it does work, then make sure you're consistent with that NPC. So if they meet them again, it's consistent. If you've got a voice, keep it consistent. If you've got an attitude, keep that attitude consistent with the NPC, and then that wins over the players as well. But it's really immerses them into the game. The strongholds very much, I think, depends, you're right, on the theme, the tone, and the style of the game to a large degree. That can come down to the GM, that can come down to setting. But one thing I learned very much the value of over years of getting it wrong was, you know, if you are going to have any kind of base of operation or stronghold or, you know, a place the players generally hang out in, just don't keep removing them. You know, don't take it away. It can happen, but it shouldn't happen every single campaign. I mean, it just isn't a base of operation. And that's another reason that breeds on to players that are so used to having, if we have anything, the DM's going to take it away from us. So you see a lot of lone wolf characters. You know, I don't have any family that are alive. I don't trust anybody else. And if the GM says this is this base is, you're going to base yourself in this city, I ain't interested. So you're absolutely right. You see a lot of that in games. So I've learned the value of, like, if you're going to make it, and that's going to be a safe haven, then try and keep it a safe haven, unless there's a particular reason, realistic reason, as you say, repercussion reason that something should change. Fair enough. And the players will trust you and forgive you if you have to do something. It's just a thought. We're now moving on to adventure design. But I think it's worth, before we go a little deeper into structuring stories and how these GMs do it, how these guys do it, it's worth mentioning plot hooks. They're a little different, really, than a couple of the areas that we've talked about. What is a plot hook? If you could sum it up for the people watching, please, Addison. What's your view of a plot hook?
A plot hook is a small piece of information that it interests your characters in exploring that piece of information. So it could be something like the whole town to the north is asleep. Everyone's asleep and you can't wake them up.
Right.
That's your plot hook. Like, and then they go, well, that's weird. Why is that? And they go and have a look and see what's going on up there in the north. And that, I would say, it's like a I try and make them like a sentence long.
Yeah, yeah.
And like basically, there's
Do
short
you
pieces of
have?
information.
Do you have a kind of are they like your kind of testing ground? You know, like you'll throw a few out and see which ones the players, because they are hooks, which one they will take.
Oh yeah, so like I might bait one by making someone who they're talking to mention it.
Yeah.
And the promise of reward, I might just throw a few out there. Like that's what job boards are for, right? Like
yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
the town,
that's a perfect location to place a few plot hooks. Absolutely.
Yeah. So yeah, perfect.
Love that. Ben, your thoughts on plot hooks?
Yeah, I think the best sort of method is to throw a bunch out there, and then, like, if a player's interested in, like, run with that idea, and you don't even have to ever come back to these ideas, or you can just throw them in the next town. I think players, as much as we like to think they'll remember a lot of things, often don't, and you can use that to your advantage. Like, the plot hooks, like, all the plot hooks that you, like, tie together, they're going to think, oh, wow, you're a genius, but they're going to forget about the 10 or 15 other ones that they kind of ignored, and you just haven't dealt with since then. So I think if you throw a bunch of them out, and kind of only really use the ones that they're actually interested in, you're going to have a much more enjoyable game. I wouldn't write, I would write plot hooks, but not loads of backstory behind them. Usually just give them like a few little hints that there's something here. But be prepared for the players to like never touch them. So don't put all your time just planning what's behind the plot hook. Just do the hooks.
You know, I'm a great believer in. I would rather overload plot hooks than have too few. So I'm a great believer in chucking out lots of little threads and then seeing which ones the players kind of interested in and letting them decide. And maybe it is a lot, but the point is I want them to feel that the world can go in the direction that they want it to. So I want them to have as much choice on that. And if they decide to come up with something on their own as well, if they find something that they're interested in that becomes their own plot hook, I'm happy to embrace it fully and go for it. So great points, guys. Before we move on, I just want to touch back on something you said in the previous section, Ben. Really good, actually. You used a line, I think, very apt, actually, about, and I think you said it in a really brilliant way, which was about satisfying adventures have clear endings. And I think that's worth mentioning here, because when we're talking about structuring stories, it's really important to have that vision in your mind. It's the same with campaign design as well. We touched on it, but I think before I talk about the structure in these adventures a little bit more, I just want to ask you both this question about campaigns. Do you prefer campaigns that are more grand scheme as a GM? Do yours have a sort of a beginning, middle, and end, but massive swathe of parts between it? Or is it more episodal, if you will? Forgive me for saying it, more like a Star Trek episode where it doesn't matter, they're not really connected, but the overall is great. But they all are part of the greater web of what's going on. How do you approach it? What kind of style do you have? Just before we move into this bit, I'll start with Anderson on that part about campaigns, the grand scheme.
I'm a grand scheme guy. There's usually little things peppered throughout that that come together. So I think the best analogy I have for this, and I'm sorry if this makes me sound like a massive nerd.
No, go for it.
In Battlestar Galactica, there is pieces of music that continue to play through every episode that don't make sense, right? And then at the end, the finale episode, they bring all those pieces of music together to form All Along the Watchtower by Jimi Hendrix.
Brilliant.
Yeah. And I learn a massive bit of storytelling, like I don't know, like technique from that. Like these little bits of music are like your story. They don't seem to mesh. Yeah. Like they don't seem to mesh, but then eventually it comes to a head in this big climactic battle or something.
And if your players, that's brilliant, because even if your players, if you had something like that in a game, even if they missed it, it doesn't matter to the overall enjoyment. It can be missed and it doesn't matter because the music was still theme and tone at the time it was used. I think that's great. Love that. Ben, how do you feel about the campaign episodal approach or more grand scheme?
I kind of try and run it like a season of TV where each episode you could watch by itself. Like you could just show up for a few episodes here and there. but there are like things that will carry over and sort of lead you to the finale, because I think every individual kind of session needs to stand on its own, really, because you might have the new player that only shows up for that one, or you might have someone miss a session, and you can't necessarily have, because like everyone that we're playing with now is like an adult who lives adult lives, and they kind of might not make it to every session, and that's just something we kind of have to expect. Not everyone can make every session, so I try and make it so it's kind of like a season of TV. Like, you could watch each individual episode, but if you watch them all, you'll kind of see where we're going by the end.
Yeah, you know me, it's the grand scale. I really, that's the one aspect of the games that is very unique to the way I tend to run them. I really think very deeply. The beginning, middle, and end are critical. How people get there, it doesn't matter. If they don't reach the end, that might not necessarily matter either. It depends what their end is, really. I might have my own vision of it, but what it actually becomes is the key, really, and that we've all embraced it. Hopefully, I've bought their buy-in. But I like the grand scheme, and I like to think of it as an onion. So it's a multifaceted, layered thing that, you know, has so many parts of it. I think you touched on the Battlestar Galactica, and they use the theme tune. But honestly, I think the way I tend to approach the game is very much around all these different avenues that, if the players put it together, I think Ben's a good testament to this. They suddenly go, oh yeah, that all links now. That all makes sense. I didn't see it before, but look at that. I love that, because again, it gets that buy-in and stuff from the players, and a deeper appreciation of the craft of what you're doing as a GM as well, which is really important. So brilliant. Okay, structuring adventures we're now at. This is the bit where I really want to get to, really. If we're talking about the one session, which is really what the key is for any GM, that session that you're about to run, have you got any kind of advice about how you would do a set-piece session? You know, how do you plan your set-piece session? What kind of tips, advice you would give? Thoughts around that? It's quite deep, so don't be afraid to expand on your answers. And how are you doing for time? Are we okay to continue on?
I'm good to carry on.
You're happy to carry on? Sorry to say that, but it's very important that we make sure you're okay. Yeah, so how do you feel about that? We'll start with Addison first. So a set-piece sort of situation where it's that one session. But obviously it could expand out into other sessions, but just for the purpose of the video, it's a set piece that you've planned for that night. How do you go about doing it? What are your tips and advice around those kind of situations, and how do you do it?
So I do it in terms of story beats. I set out a whole bunch of story beats that can be skipped or missed. But I'll basically make like a handful.
Could you explain to the great audience again what is the story beat for those that?
So story beats are like checkpoints in a story.
Fantastic.
That signify where you are. So building tension, stuff like that. Yeah. So my one of the best examples I've got of this is for my birthday I ended up running like a murder mystery D&D session where everybody put how they would kill the person in a hat, and we randomly chose and ran the scenario of that person having killed that person, but having killed the victim in their way. So I had all the clues and everything, but I had the exact same story beats for no matter who got picked out of the hat, it would be the exact same story beats, because of the fact that it was in a very enclosed area. So I would also think about like how far you're willing to let them go, like not like hard clip them or entrap them, but how far do they need to go out? Because if they need to go on like days hikes, they're not going to hit all your story beats. But if they're like in a small area, you can find this object, which is a story beat. You can do this. So I very much plan story beats. And this is where that thing of moving the goalposts as well helps, because if my story beats are vague, then I can move them to be where I need them to be.
Okay, that's quite an interesting approach. And do you know yourself well enough to know how much you need to create that set piece for that night ahead, generally, so you kind of know roughly where it should go?
Yeah, so like I said, a handful is literally 5 story beats for me. Like, so one for every finger and thumb. Like, you beginning, your end, and then your middle. like, go for it. Like,
fantastic. Okay, so kind of know yourself. For you, a set piece, you kind of know what that's going to actually mean in terms of timing and how many parts to it you need.
Yeah. Sometimes it runs over, obviously, and that's what they can be skipped, and they can be, because they're so vague. They're not
can be lost or condensed.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, brilliant. Ben, how do you feel about that set piece and your thoughts and tips around it?
So usually what I'll do is I'll write down the problem first. Like, this is the problem they're going to overcome. If these problems overcome, and it's not overcome in the first 2 minutes, then that's the end of the session. So that's how we clearly get, this is how this ends. If you can figure out, if you can, let's say rescue the princess. If you can rescue the princess, then the session's over. If you can convince the gangs not to go to war with each other, then the session's over. And then I kind of work backwards from there. So I never plan any kind of solution to this. I just come up with a problem, and then all of the sort of reasons why that's a problem, and kind of work from there. So that's the same way you can tackle a dungeon. You start out with why they're going in, and then plan why that's difficult. And that usually leads to me only having a page of notes, and I can run a whole 4-hour session off a page. So I think that's kind of.
Do you know yourself? Do you know yourself well enough to know how many kind of parts you need for that session? Would you know in yourself roughly, if it was a 4-hour session, what you would need to do, or a 5-hour session? You're able to, because you know yourself well enough what you need to do that.
Yeah, I feel like I'm at the point where I can kind of feel out how big a problem is a session of problem. I mean, it really always depends on your players group of how complicated you need to make that problem. I'll use this hand so I don't take out my light. I think as long as you've got this very obvious crux to the session of there's this big thing that you need to solve, the players also know when they're getting to the end of the session, which is quite nice. So if you've got stuff that's once a session abilities, they can use them. And that will always play into, where your ending is. Let's keep this simple. I don't want to spend all of my week planning for one day. I've got things to do.
Yes.
But yeah, I get a lot of my GM style might just sound like laziness, but I've kind of done the over planning thing.
No,
I can't really.
Perfect. No,
you do graduate from being overzealous to being somewhat lazy. I feel as if that's the natural progression of things.
Yeah, because I kind of know what my players are sat down for, so I can do the least amount to get the best outcome for everyone. That probably wouldn't work if you're playing with new people every 3 weeks. But if you're consistently playing with the same people, your notes will get less and less, because you as a GM will be able to improvise the scenes that they want to see, and you'll just get more comfortable running the game, so you won't need as many notes.
Yeah, I think again it's really great to have that perspective, 2 different kind of approaches, because it's very useful for people watching and wanting to try and get something from it. I know it's really interesting because you said you sort of 5 story beats generally sort of 4 hours, that sort of thing, which is totally understandable. I only need 4 key parts. That's how I work in a 4-hour session. It starts with the beginning and there's an end. So I want to make sure that I know what the beginning is, because that's critical. I need to know what the end is for that part. Ideally, even if it's running a campaign, I still hopefully want something to end at a point that is at least logical, or at least at a point that feels satisfactory enough. It doesn't have to be perfect. I hate cliffhangers personally as a GM, but sometimes they're necessary. It's a necessary evil if it has to be done. I think it's a bit frustrating, exactly for the reason you touched on as well, Ben, where, and Addison, where sometimes players are missing. So if they're missing and then, they come for the cliffhanger but then miss the next bit, it's a double loss. And again, you lose investiture. So what I try to do is when it comes to sort of set piece, I try to have 4 parts. Now, how the players get between each of the parts, frankly, is not important. The key goal is to allow them the flexibility to maneuver to those parts in any way that they want to. It's understanding how the parts connect together. That's really what a set piece is. It's understanding that flow. And once you understand that as a GM, I think it becomes a lot easier to kind of, really tackle the subject and start really thinking about really how clever and how intricate you want it to become. Because, some GMs are really good at kind of having a set piece sort of story, a night's work, and really branching out, having loads of potential possibilities for it to go in different directions. I think that's probably something you do quite naturally, Ben, branching out, allowing that branch out. Is that a kind of, would I be right in picking that up on your style of GMing, that you are quite flexible in the over-approach and how people get to different bits of the story?
Yeah, I never really ever plan solutions, because every time you plan a solution, they find out some other bullshit way of doing it, let's be honest. So I kind of, if you keep your notes succinct and you work on your improv skills, no matter where they kind of take it, you can kind of go with them. And you're never at that minute where you're kind of like, guys, I need 5 minutes here to just figure out what we're going to do for the next hour. So that's kind of I definitely like the sort of spread out, because otherwise we could all just be playing like a computer game, you know?
Is yours quite rigid between the pieces that you've developed, your five beats, if you will, or is it quite flexible the way that it evolves as the night unfolds, Anderson?
It's very flexible, because I'm more than willing to adapt and move something to fit into the scenario we're in. So let's say the beginning is the gang's like. So the beginning is you've been tasked by the local mayor to get the gangs to work together because bandits are coming. So the next story beat is obviously going to meet one of the gang people. How you do that could be literally on the way from the mayor's office. You know who they are, or it could be you set a trap for them, whatever. The second thing is to meet someone else. Third, and then the last one is to report back to the mayor, or go out and get the bandits, however you want to do it. So I know that I can move those NPCs to where I need them to be and where they are.
Right. Okay.
I the only time I ever do like solid like non-movable stuff is when it's location. Yeah, it's like when it's a location. So there may be a bit of like forced like cajoling.
Because I mention it here because we talked earlier about, you know, pre-written campaigns and more flexible approach homebrew games. And we're kind of, all three of us are kind of illustrating that we're quite flexible in our approach, because obviously in a written game, the set piece will be, you have to do this to achieve that. There's very little interplay there, or very limited, unless you have got a lot of experience and can kind of build different links to make it work. So I kind of want to just illustrate this momentarily for anybody listening in, so that it can kind of get an idea what I mean when we talk about branching out without going too deep. So it might be a simple thing like a Cthulhu game where you've got an initial setup where you know that the setup of the game is the players are going to meet in a club in London. You know that they're going to be tasked with something that's going to be quite dramatic, that's going to send their characters off to Egypt. You know when they get to Egypt that there's going to be a location that's already been robbed, and there's going to be some clues there to who's done it. So you can see the kind of initial first step and second step. And for me, the first step's about half hour, 40 minutes to set that all up beautifully, give off the information. And I've left a gap because I'm kind of saying to myself, okay, how are you going to get there? And they might say, right, we're going to go down and go and hire a plane, and we're going to fly for Greece. And that gives me an opportunity then maybe to throw in that other people have heard about this, and it's become a race against time, and they're trying to sabotage the players' efforts. So as a GM, that's how branching and various storytelling works. It's having those ideas and how you link off them. So I just wanted to kind of touch on that here. I wondered if I could ask this as well. Is kind of, you talked about kind of the, previously we talked about the players and their power, their impact, if you will, depending on the player style, on how important that is in general, the way you build stories, particularly for you, Addison. Does that player power, and I use that word because some players have more power than others in the nicest way because they play a certain way, maybe they're very heavy storytellers. Does that influence the way you build your stories?
I'll let Ben take this one first.
Yeah, okay.
I think player power definitely, like, you kind of have to play to the player types a lot, especially when designing your adventures, right?
Yeah.
And obviously some of the players around the table, because of their player type, have more power to influence the other players. And so, yeah, I think definitely you really need to take that into account when you're sat around the table. Like, my current player group, I would never do like political thing with, because they're just not going to engage with that.
Great example, yeah, because it's very immersive role play, very deep, and so it wouldn't quite fit with them.
Yeah, they like to role play, but they also like, I don't think just going around and talking to some people and doing like Machiavellian stuff really works for them. So I think, yeah, definitely you sort of have to take into account like who your players are and who among those players is most likely to pull the group in certain directions.
Yeah, great. Addison, what do you think of that?
I think very similarly, but in terms of character arcs instead. So sometimes I plan sessions to have a very specific character-led focus. So the NPCs or the situation that they might find themselves in is very beneficial to certain characters. A good example of this was in the campaign that I ran at the club, the Taldore campaign I ran. There was a large section that was devoted to a character like doing his rite of passage. Like there was like a section that we had to take out, and that was a couple of sessions. And it was because at the time his power, in terms of like the storytelling aspect and like the investment, was at an all-time high. So I could do that, and because all the other players had bought into that, and because he had done the work, again that collaborative thing, I could get away with it. Whereas I think if I tried to force that on certain players now, especially in this new normal where we're not face to face and people can't see how I'm talking, they might get a bit defensive and a bit like, well, why is it not my time to shine? And I'm like, well, because we're not in a scenario where you can right now. So
you're illustrating very well there. You're illustrating this kind of point, aren't you? That basically a well-designed adventure, it's something you're obviously doing, contains kind of the right elements, if that's the right word, of appeal for the group generally most of the time. But obviously there are moments for some characters to shine over others, but you'll account for everybody in due process.
Yeah, like that we genuinely called it character arcs by the end of our campaign. We remembered certain sections of play as this person's character arc, and nobody was bored because they all had investments in each other and their characters, and what that person was going to achieve was going to help the overall goal.
Good. Okay. Yeah. I want to touch on something that was sort of raised, because again, we're sort of talking about general structure of games and adventures and kind of the way that GMs are looking at it. And it's an area that I don't see many people talking about it, which is really surprising, because I think it's very important for GMs to know. So here's an area that Ben touched on, which really made me have to step back, actually, and really think about this, because he talked about it the other day to me, and then I caught the thought, crikey, I didn't realise it was that difficult or that rare now to see, but obviously he's right. Dungeons and other unstructured adventures should form a part of the conversation we have tonight, because I think dungeoneering, or the art of a good dungeon from a GMing perspective, seems to becoming a lost art form. Ben talked about this, and I think it's right if I just hand the floor over to him. And I wonder if you would recap the reasons why you feel that this is becoming more of a lost art form.
It's less that it's becoming more of a lost art form, and more that it's becoming less of a focus for everyone. Like, if we look back at the Village of Homelet from, is that AD&D or is that basic?
Yeah,
old school D&D.
Right back. Yeah.
The Moat House dungeon, you have no plot reason to go there, but there's gold there, so you kind of assumed you go there. Whereas, like, I think that doesn't really work if we're looking at like our current kind of the current trends and play style is very much.
Could you capitalise? Could you just explain a little bit more about the current trend style? Because I think it's really important, because a lot of GMs who might come across this video and if be probably really caught up in that general play style.
I think it's much more a here's a big story and we're all playing this big story, rather than kind of like in the old school you would like not necessarily in one big story, you were adventurers going through different trials and tribulations. Like the modules were called modules because you were supposed to slot them in. Like
the module was the kind of episode, the Star Trek episode, if you will. That module, no matter how many parts it took, was an episode. yeah, whether it took 3 months to complete, it was an episode. Yeah, sorry.
I also think that so there used to be a meme like there's not enough dragons in my Dungeons and Dragons, and I think we've now started to go towards the other way, where there's not enough dungeons in my Dungeons and Dragons. Like we want to get to like those epic moments of like Ben said, epic stories, narrative, and creative master set pieces, and then we don't actually do like the grind, because that's what the dungeon is commonly referred to, isn't it?
I find that very interesting, because you see the thing is that's really great on this is obviously I kind of didn't know, so it's a classic thing. It's like I just I didn't know that this was a problem. I didn't realize it was an issue. And it kind of is, because it's been referred to in a way where when I sort of dug around, what Ben mentioned the other day, I kind of took a step back now. I've just realised how how much people, because Ben hit the nail on the head when he said, look, if you consider all the way that people now consume their initial learning of different games, particularly 5th edition, it's through the normality of YouTube and various other mediums, which is fair to say. And through that, they'll often come across programs like Critical Role, very good, bringing people into the hobby, great. But they generate a style of play very much away from that old kind of approach to it. So I guess a lot of people are just not used to or not seen the classic dungeons or the structured episodic kind of stuff in any detail. How do you feel, Ben, in terms of... how would you kind of sum this up? Do you think it's a missing palette color now? Do you think a lot of GMs are just used to doing this anymore? Or what do you feel about it?
I feel like there are certain players, and there's certain moods where that's kind of the game you want to play, but because there's not really a demand for it, no GMs are really running it anymore. So I certainly think that the emphasis on story and these arcing narratives is cool and interesting, but sometimes you don't want to play that. You want to play, this is my adventure, I want to see their ways of dealing with all their trials and tribulations that aren't necessarily this giant meta plot. You might just want to show up and live as this dude for a little bit. So I think as much as having the big story moments is super cool and is a really cool way to play the game, I think we also shouldn't think that's the only way to play.
Yes.
And we should look at sort of the other ways that everything can be played. Like Vampire the Masquerade is very much a different game to 5th edition. And
absolutely, yeah.
Old
Comes
school
back
D&D.
to that theme and tone again, doesn't it?
Yeah, I would argue old school D&D is massively different to new school D&D, where I think it is more based on plot and these big meta plots.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot more material for you now as a D&D player to create those grandiose, even how they generate characters now gives you this grandiose thing straight away. Whereas before, you're turning up in your rusty bucket armor, and you've picked a guild quest up pretty much. Whereas now it's you can be a folk hero. You've already seen off a rebellion. Or you've already overseen a rebellion if you're a folk hero in D&D backgrounds and stuff like that. So I think,
Well, I mean, obviously, I'm so used to how I kind of come into the hobby. So a lot of what is kind of the modern approach is kind of something you kind of do anyway. If you're an experienced GM, because you've got to have built up, you've kind of got to have followed the audience. This is something I think that's quite interesting, because I think you end up kind of building quite sweeping. I'm going to grab a tea while I can. There you go. Thank you.
Dad?
Yeah. Well, I'm getting a question live on air here, Dad. Yeah. What is the question?
Can you come upstairs?
I will in a minute. Yeah, don't worry. All right, thank you, darling. There's a question live on air. That's more important than D&D. But I kind of feel you end up with these classic. You follow your audience. So over time, you realise how important it is to have all the colours of the palette. How important it is to be adaptable, like you say, Ben. In terms of sometimes it's good to do that, and sometimes it's actually good to have that sweeping story arc or more character-driven stuff. I think it's a shame for me, it's looking like more of a lost art form. I think a lot of people haven't cut their teeth on, a dungeon style to build that kind of base of colour, and then build off it, and then take the best bits of what you've done there and then add into your DMing. I think it's worth doing. I love a good old-fashioned dungeon as a GM, because I think it really challenges me to make that story as, Tomb of Hoblet was a complete bastion. It wasn't just an unrelated event. It was, there is a village. Why is it there, Sean? Who are these people? What's going to happen? I really, really had to think that way, and that's how we were as GMs. We had to think about the bigger story. So although look at the modules now and see only 8 or 9 pages or 10 pages and think, well, I don't know, what, it's just a set piece. No, the GMs would actually really fill in all the blanks they're missing. I think that was the great skill of the writing of that era, was it encouraged you to not just run it as written, but actually build around that framework and really encompass it. So you kind of got the both of both styles, if that makes sense. And I think that might have been, kind of lost a little in the translation over the years, because I can totally see the benefits, massive benefits of things like Critical Role and what it's done for bringing people into the game, as well as other genres like Stranger Things, how that's brought a lot of players in and, made D&D fantastic again. What did you think overall on your... Very soon, darling. Very soon. She gets very edgy. But she's important. So, Ben, you've seen us run... I mean, it's worth mentioning here. So you've seen me run... I don't... it's been part of the palette colour. It's not what we're doing. But we've just recently done a bit more of what I would call a dungeon crawl as such. But we're definitely a very modern take on it. And everything very well, even the politics of the place and hopefully even the logic of the way it's laid out. Would you confirm that, or what were your thoughts seeing that in play? Just for the benefit of the audience, really, because obviously it's interesting when we're talking about adventure design.
Yeah, I think we did a traditional dungeon, but instead of us being in that dungeon for a monetary reason, which is kind of the old school style, is you're always wanting to gain money because it was XP, right? We were in there for character focused reasons.
Yeah.
So as much as it was designed like an old school dungeon, it wasn't. The motivations weren't the same. If you get me.
Yeah.
You've gone from Indiana Jones and tomb robbing to quests. Like there's something in there that you need and stuff like that.
Yeah. So where
the players had a personal motivation for wanting to go in and actually deal with it. They had a personal motivation to get in there. Now, you didn't really know fully what was going on, but there were some great moments in that. All again. Just fantastic because of the way that it worked. A good one was yourself, Ben. They observed a ruined temple that people were still coming to, and there was odd ways to get into it, and it wasn't clear why people were operating in it. And there was a brilliant bit where Ben's character playing a halfling goes up to a door and triggers a trap, but because of the way the trap was set, it actually passed harmlessly over his head, which I found really brilliant. It was the only character he could avoid it if he set it off, because he was a halfling. And his moment of his hat falling off his head and his mopping his own personal brow. I bet I really felt that come across, even though I couldn't see him, and it was really good. So that was a lot of fun there. And so I think it's all I'm trying to say here is I think a missing colour worth exploring every now. And if you've got groups out there, maybe they are really into this. So if you're really into dungeon bashes or crawls or whatever you want to call them, and your GM is, and that works for you, then great. What does it matter? That's brilliant. Good, enjoy it. But hopefully you can encourage it a little into some of your games for character-driven reasons, which is what Addison is very good at, I think. So we've covered off the basics of tonight. I just wanted to do the adventure design, just the basics. Don't go too deep, just to give people an overview of it. Did you want to add anything or ask any questions off that tonight that either of you had now you've considered it? I know there's a lot to take in because we cover a lot in these sessions. But what were your thoughts? Any questions that you had?
I was going to ask, because you guys obviously run very different systems. Do you design your adventures in a way that allows for milestone leveling, or are you still very much EXP led DM? Because I prefer milestones personally, and therefore I put in narrative beats and narrative bookends that allow for that milestone to a conclusion that goes, right, you've gone through an experience now.
Yeah, it totally depends on the game for me. Totally depends on the game. I've let Forbidden Lands because it's its own theme and tone. It has a certain style, the way it likes to hand out the experience, which I absolutely love. Which is kind of a little checklist for the players to go, did you achieve this tonight? No. Okay, you don't get an experience point for that. Did you do this? Yes, I did. Good, you get a point for that. So it helps push them to want to achieve without you as a GM having to force it, which I really like. So in a way, it's kind of milestone-y, but it's not.
Yeah.
But it really works. It works really well because, and I like milestones too, but I also I don't mind leveling up systems, but I always feel that they kind of, the problem is they're very loaded towards that point when you've reached enough experience points. So you get that boom, and it's a big boom normally when you level up, which is fine. I kind of like approaches, and I love 5th edition D&D, just so it's critical. I loved it, 5th edition. In fact, actually, I'm going to say I actually quite like, this is the first time I've ever said this about Paizo product for a long time. Fell out of love with Pathfinder First 2 Crunchy. I'm very impressed with Pathfinder 2nd edition because they've gone a different route. Now, there's still some crunch, but it's nowhere near the way it was before. And hats off to them for attempting to take a game that was far too crunchy and come back a bit. Well done. Still a long way to go, but it's a start.
Yeah, for me, it definitely does depend on the system and the kind of XP. Like, I would definitely do milestones for 5th edition, but Dungeon World is like you're failing upwards, so I'd use their own XP system. I think it really depends. If your XP system's just based on killing things, that's not the games I'm running, so that's not what I'm going to hand out XP for. So yeah, it really is just dependent on the system itself. Yeah,
great question though. Did you have any questions you want to ask, Ben? Or you can have follow-up questions as well, Addison. Anything else you want to throw in at all?
I'll let other people, because I've only got 2.
Okay.
I actually don't have any questions, so if you've got another one, you can.
Go ahead.
My second question was obviously for module play, but by the sounds of things, a lot of us, not many of us run modules like religiously, and even when we get our hands on them, we're going to change them to suit our style, which is fine. Do you think that there's a difference in terms of something like Adventurers League, like these public play sessions? And do you think that they're good for DMs, or do you think they're bad because of the fact that all that creative direction is taken out of their hands? Because I've tried to understand Adventurers League for a long time, and I just don't. I can't understand the fact that things have to happen in a certain way.
I think it's a playstyle thing. Like, as we said, the whole old school, you just go to a dungeon to go get the loot versus the grand story thing. I think that's like another palette color of, like, I feel like people who play the Adventurers League enjoy that style of play, if you get me, where it's all sort of planned out for them. And that's, I mean, if you enjoy that style of play, like, more power to you. Keep doing it, bro.
Yeah, okay.
I hate it, really. I found it too restrictive. I was asked to join and involve and help, but I found that I was very much it's like being a stick of dynamite in a small box. It's useless to me. It's too restrictive. And I found a lot of players that were very talented players were also quite restricted by the Adventurers Leagues and weren't able to kind of express themselves in the way they want to. And if they dared challenge the story in a unique way, you would breaks what you want to happen that particular night. I don't like those kind of things personally. I get, like Ben says, it's a play style. Some people really thrive on it. And I think there's a little bit of ego in there for some of the GMs that run it as well. I found that a little bit when I cross it. There's a little bit of, doing this and they get rewarded for doing it. Fair enough. If you enjoy that, that's up to you. But I think there are many ways that you can get enjoyment out of the hobby. I just think Adventurers League is very much set up for some clubs, some conventions, and it just isn't for me, because I think you end up set in. It's like trying to get a captive audience to buy your products. I just don't. That's not how I'm going to be. As a GM, I like to be able to. I will mostly buy the system, so I want to have free range on what I want to get.
Yeah, because I was going to say the same sort of thing. Like, I think the thing that's really put me off is the fact that one of my friends, Sumi, who helped set up the Loom, actually, she's like major into it for her club, but then she's like, I have to report to a marshal. And as soon as she said that, like my little ears like went, marshal?
Yeah.
Like, what? And I'm like, who? Like, and then she explained it. I'm like, I just don't get it, and I don't get the rules. So I'm like, I was wondering what your guys think of that was.
Is the marshal the final boss of Game Masters?
Well, that's what I thought. Like, what the hell? Like, what a word to use to.
You want all your GMs. They want all their GMs to run the game, that particular story that's written for that night. You know, they're released. You know, kind of like, if you will, as an event every few weeks. You get one to run, and it's just not my cup of tea. I'm sorry. No, it's just no good for me. I'd rather someone hand me something that I haven't had a chance to read, and then go ahead, Sean, try run this in 10 seconds, go for it. I much prefer that. It's more challenging. I do like, to be honest with you, I do love standalone. Just so it's known. I mean, people know me, know this. I love standalone adventures. If there's a good classic dungeon module, I've got it. I've run it. I love them. I think you can tailor them to anything you want. To be honest with you, and I think it's a brilliant missing palette color. If you can surround yourself with brilliant material that you can use or draw inspiration from, I love them.
Are those adventures just available? Like, could we download an Adventurers League adventure just from the internet?
Yeah, you can get them. They're readily available out there.
I can ask Sumi if you want to have a look at them, Ben.
Yeah, they are out there. It's a great question. It's a great question around adventure design.
I just wanted to get your, because I know, Sean, you've done like published stuff.
Yeah.
So you've got your name on stuff. Ben, you're from what I understand from the times where we've worked at Club's sake, your creative ideas and stuff, and like your implementation of stuff's really good. And then I don't think Adventurers League's that good, like Sean said.
I love the freedom. I like GMs. So, see, the thing is, I think what's really interesting about GMing in general is it's like I said back in the first video, it is the circle. Everybody's on that circle, and it is a circle. It's a definitive circle. It just depends where you start on it, and you will go around that circle many times. If you really enjoy DMing, you will go over it many times during the time that you DM. And let's hope people want to DM for a long time. So I think it's a hobby that transcends age. Okay, it's one of the very rare hobbies that you can do for as long as you want to. If there's an audience that want to listen to what you have to say, go on DMing. Yeah. There'll always be people who want to go on playing. That's a rarity in these times. So it's a brilliant thing to embrace. And I think the other thing is about this hobby that's very rare is that everything that you love and you buy, it's like, yeah, I've bought Forbidden Lands. I love it. Ben loves it too. And it's a system I will use with other players for sure. Find the right group, I'll definitely use it. And the thing is, although it might have cost me, whatever, it was 40 quid to buy the box set, the truth is, I've already got 10 sessions out of it. By the time I've finished using this, and maybe never finish using it, because it's a system I can see myself running many times, it's going to be basically every session has probably cost me a fraction of a penny by the time I've finished it. It'll be incredible value, frankly, is what role-playing gives you when it's good. Also, it can be a waste of money because you buy something and never use it, and that's another story for another time because I'm a great collector. I've got stuff I don't use. But I do get inspiration. I do get inspiration from everything. If I've got it, there's a reason I've got it, and it is probably going to be somewhere down the line where it's mechanically. I think there's something interesting, or whether there's something in the story.
That's fantasy age for me. I'm never going to play that game.
yeah, I can understand that. Yeah, so it is interesting, definitely as a thing. And I've really got no further questions because you guys have really touched on brilliantly tonight about what I wanted to cover, the two parts of tonight. And we're going to go deeper again because next time we are going to look at some of the core skills that GMs have. So I want you both to go away and have a think about a question I want to make, which is this. I want you to it's one simple question with 7 possible answers, right? They're not deep. They're just your opinion. If you had to sum up DMing with 7 key words without referring to each other, go away, write down 7 keywords that you believe would sum up what would make a great GM. I want to see next time, we're going to sort of dissect that a little bit, what 7 words you come up with. You could call them pillars if you will. What pillars prop up great GMing? It's the only bit of homework I'm going to give you throughout the series. But it's really important because we'll probably find that many of those words, we'll use them, they'll overlap quite considerably. And I really need that for next time because we will talk on different subjects. That's going to be one of them. We're definitely going to be talking about how people ad-lib and the skills of ad-libbing. So thanks very much for tonight. It's been an absolute pleasure spending some time with you both again. Probably be another couple of weeks, I presume. But
right,
really enjoy.
Let's do our individual plugging of the things that we're doing right now. So, Addison, you want to start first?
I'm at the Pod of Many Things with Leon and Troy. We're currently on a bit of a hiatus at the moment as we do some regathering of ourselves with schedules and stuff. But all in all, you can catch us on Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube.
Sean, what are you up to nowadays on the internet?
Getting older. No, it's very simple. There's nothing really to comment on. I'm still working on different things for different moment. But if you need to hook us up, most people know how to find us. Please do. A good GM will always seek out other GMs. Please come and seek us out. If you've got questions or you just need some mentoring, then just ask, and we're always there for you. Anybody that knows that knows that. And there's been many people we've worked with over the last few years. I really appreciate those people who've come back to me and wanted further support or help or ideas. Fantastic. Thank you very much. You go out and keep building the groups, because that's the goal really for this now moving forward.
And if you're watching this, you're already on my channel, so I mean, stick around.
Damn fine channel.
Some great stuff.
Comment below. Comment,
like, subscribe, ring the bell.
Very quickly, Ben, what videos are you going to be releasing very soon, just for your channel? Just
every time I say this, I never make that video.
Well, let's make it a purpose that you do make that video. What are you doing next? Are you covering off other role-playing games?
I think next is either going to be the expansion for Forbidden Lands, or it's going to be the differences between playing at a club and playing at a home game. It's going to be one of those
Great.
two.
Like to see those soon, actually. So please make sure they happen.
Right. Well, thank you, everyone. We'll see you in 2 weeks for the next part of this. It's the Loom GM panel.
Thank you very much.